pictures of places.
But we are pretty much going. All right.
All right, welcome back after lunch. This is WIMSE, the Workload Identity and Multi-Service Environments Working Group meeting at IETF 121. I'm Peter Kesselman, your co-chair, and Justin.
Hi, I'm Justin Richer, and so welcome back to WIMSE, everybody. This is the Note It Well. It's on Thursday. If you haven't been paying attention to this yet, this actually applies to everything that you've been doing all week. So make sure you do pay attention to that. A couple of quick notes. Everybody in the room, please scan the QR codes. There's one on the mic stands. You can also get to this from the agenda tracker. That's how they count how many people are in the room, so they give us the right size room each time. So please do that. That's also how we're going to be doing all queuing for all questions. Remote participants, please keep your audio and video off unless you are actively speaking or presenting, and use of a headset is recommended in those cases as well. So once again, this is Workload Identity and Multi-System Environments with our wonderfully obtuse and overly dense AI-generated logo, which we just have to keep coming back to because I don't know, I love how absurd it is. If you are looking for a different working group, we hope you stay anyway because this is going to be pretty fun. Today, we've got a pretty packed agenda. Starting with Brian asking us why we're even here in the first place. We're going to go over some of our documents that are in process and some additional work that's happening out there. We do have 10 minutes for any other business at the end of the meeting scheduled. So we're going to try and time box things pretty tightly to make sure that everything keeps moving along. And if questions need to come back in discussions at the end, we'll do it then. We already have note takers, so thanks to that. I was just going to say, and this is a chair updates slide, a chair updates presentation, and there are some updates to your chairs.
So good news, your chairs are still here. I'm Peter. I recently joined Spiral, but now I will have even more time to spend working on workload identity.
Hi, and I'm still Justin, and just now I work for Uber Ether instead of doing a million other little things. I'm just doing a million little things at Uber Ether. In practical terms, this means nothing really changes. Both Peter and I are dedicated to making sure this working group remains what it was chartered to be and what we want this community to be going forward. So let me see here.
All right, some working group resources. So please join the mailing list if you haven't. Keep an eye on the GitHub repository as well. Lots of traffic there and a good way to be involved. And of course, also our website, Justin.
Yeah, this website, I'm really excited about it. We have a really awesome looking website. You know, thanks so much to Daniel Feldman for putting this thing together. Is he here or online? No, I didn't see him. Regardless, thank you guys very much. I am super happy about this. Spice has already stolen our homework and copied it, which is awesome because this is a really great website. And just in case you guys were wondering, it could have been a lot worse. This is actually a screenshot of what the website looked like before Daniel took it over. This isn't a blank screen. That's the website text up in the corner that I put together when we first built this. So yes, thank you. I do think it is really important to have access to all of the group resources right in one place, and it looks good.
All right, and then currently we have a couple of documents. So there's the WIMSE architecture document, also OAuth client authentication BCP. So Arndt will give us an update on that, and then also service-to-service authentication. So 3 official documents. Also some other work going on that folks in the working group may want to take note of. There's the token translation work in ongoing in WIMSE, and we'll get an update on that today, as well as the authorization levels discussion. And then in the OAuth working group, transaction tokens and identity chaining, 2 drafts that is making its way through there, which would be well worth a read, especially if you're interested in token translation. And then also Kathleen cross-posted the PICA, Proof of Issuer Key Authority draft from Richard Barnes. This might be interesting for folks. For example, wherever you need signed JWKS or key sets, PICA puts together an outline for that, and that does get used in places like Spiffy and Spire specific to distribute things like trust bundles. So it might be interesting for folks to just take a look at that as well.
All right, and with that, I want to remind people that WIMSE was very explicitly chartered to be a discussion forum for things beyond just the working group drafts themselves. That was a very important part of us for building and starting and building this community. So yeah, please check this stuff out. Please read especially the PICA document, because it was cross-posted over to us, and provide your thoughts there. And with that, check out the website for all of the information. This is also linked from Data Tracker, and it links to Data Tracker, so we've got some nice circular references. With that, Brian is up with our first presentation. Here, do you want slides from your side? Yeah, you should. There we go. I think you might have to choose which one. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Should be right at the top.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for giving me the time here. Justin introduced it as asking why we're here. I had a somewhat different way of phrasing it, which is, what are we really doing here? Somewhat clever acronym for WIMSE here, which is, what is it we might say we are doing here? So I want to do muse on that a little bit, and maybe you got it.
Mm-hmm. She'll see.
So here is the charter of the working group. Much like the note well, you probably haven't read it. You're not going to read it now, and if you're not going to read it now anyway, even if you have read it. But it seemed like a good thing to put on here. This is what we're working on, or why we're here. More recently, I noticed that we had some nice coverage on the main page of the IETF here with a little blog post. You won't read this now either, but it seemed like a nice thing to include here. WIMSE itself, we had our first working group meeting at IETF 119 in Brisbane. Many of you know I like to put pictures in here, and my Brisbane picture was a great one that I like. This is a great opportunity to say, what am I trying to say? It was an excuse to include a picture, but also because I borrowed some content from that meeting itself that I believe was put together by Justin. So thanks for that. And speaking of Justin, he quoted some of that content saying it gets weird. And I think we are going to get a little bit weird here, but I'm going to try to bring it back to not weird and just talk about the various pieces and where we can go. We've been doing t-shirts a little bit. Apologies to those that haven't followed the inside and bad jokes today, but t-shirts are a thing. And this is Justin playing in a band called ZZ Oth. I am wearing the fan t-shirt of ZZ Oth. It's a bit of a moment for us. All right.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome. So this is a diagram I stole from Justin. This is one he described as weird, or I think weirder, from IETF 119. But this kind of, I'm better with pictures than words. So this kind of laid out some of the things that maybe you could pull from our charter, all the various points in processing that WIMSE maybe might discuss here. And we have sort of the outside world of maybe you're doing OAuth and a client with a token calling into a logical system that has a gateway and maybe a few services. And maybe that's one of those services itself has to call across to another trust domain that has a gateway or something else. And that service itself is one logical service, but inside it has many logical services. And this is one perception of maybe a call chain that WIMSE here might want to deal with some of the components of, or specifying some of the security properties of. So I'm going to use this diagram to talk about a few of the things. It's a nice diagram, which is why I stole it. So outside outside of this world, you might be doing, from the perspective of WIMSE, I consider this, and I don't think it's controversial, that this is out of scope. You might be doing vanilla OAuth here. You might be doing session cookies. Maybe you're looking at domain-bound session credentials, which are an interesting thing coming out of somewhere else, or really whatever suits your deployment's needs. It's out of scope with us, but you're probably doing some kind of authorization, authentication, session management, but WIMSE doesn't care. That's outside of our purview, in my opinion, anyway. Inside, on these individual services or workloads, we are offering some aspiring solutions for service-to-service authentication through the draft WIMSE service-to-service authentication. We'll be talking about that a little bit more, but this particular tiny piece of the architecture is at least trying to be addressed by the service-to-service solution. For inside, from sort of the complete transactional nature of, or sort of inside, I say the call chain or the call stack or the call graph sometimes, there is work happening in the OAuth working group alluded to by our chairs earlier called transaction tokens, which is one bit of work that attempts to address this kind of problem, how you can take the entire sort of context, authorization, authentication, call text of the whole sort of transaction or call chain, embed that in a token and pass it away all the way down through the call chain within the context of your trust domain, loosely defined. And that could be used in conjunction with service-to-service authentication. It's not one or the other. It could be two different things flowing together. But that's work that's happening right now in the OAuth working group, and I think at least addresses this desired need more than what we have in this working group for this particular use case, which, as I understand it right now, is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's some interesting work to folks that are interested in here. Note that transaction tokens already also includes some discussion of token exchange, which is how perhaps the gateway might use token exchange to get a transaction token based on whatever it got from the outside. Whatever it is, a gateway might exchange that for a transaction token that would flow down the rest of its call chain within. Oh, yeah, and we talked about it in the working group. So there's an official photo of the working group, probably a violation of some policy. For cross-domain, going from some service or something, some component, really undefined in one domain, across domain to call APIs in another domain, workloads, I don't know, these terms are interchangeable, but to facilitate this cross-domain kind of exchange, we have a number of existing solutions. One is the authorization grant part of, I see that I have the monitor now, of RFC 7523 and some of its base specs. That stuff existed before there was authorization server metadata for OAuth, but now can be used together to make kind of a nice package, which the authorization server metadata can tell you can be published by the target system that you're going cross domain to, and by both systems actually, to figure out which pieces where you need to call, and also publish things like keys to establish trust. But these authorization grant pieces of OAuth, 7523 is out of OAuth, and basically defines a cross-domain JOT format specifically geared at this kind of exchange, to go cross-domain, to codify a construct to facilitate cross-domain acquisition of an access token to call APIs at the other side. And later on, metadata can help describe how that happens and even further facilitate that setup of the trust of that. There's also OAuth identity and authorization chaining across domains draft in OAuth that is more or less a description of how those RFCs and token exchange can be used together to facilitate exactly this kind of use case. Although in that context, it's geared more at end user identity than workload identity. In the end, identity is identity, and there's nothing prohibiting them to be used together. I do want to note that this is not OpenID Connect, despite what some very large providers out in the world have decided to call their services that look very much like this. This is just OAuth. It's not OpenID Connect. Some folks have used OpenID Connect metadata to facilitate some of the key exchange and trust, and in turn have called the services that, but at least to me, it causes more confusion than it helps, but I needed to say this. And maybe we should say something about this. I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
Brian, we have somebody in the queue. Do you want to take that now or at the end?
Happy to do it now.
Okay. Kathleen? If you intended that question for now. Okay.
Kathleen Moriarty. So just to add to the list of the options, there's also the PICA proposal that is simply a JWT and using a proposal to either use the certificate key pair for the authentication piece between containers and workloads, as opposed to, it doesn't use OAuth. So it's a simpler one. And Sharon Goldberg is the person responsible for that use case. I know Richard's been presenting the draft, but she's also responsible for Open Pub Key. And so she's got a lot of experience in this space. So I think it's worth having her engaged for the conversation directly so that she could represent the use case and her actual findings.
Having her part of the conversation and that stuff part of the conversation, absolutely agree with. My understanding of PICA is it's much more about establishing trust in a set of keys that would in turn be able to be trusted to sign an artifact that would go across domain, not PICA itself as a cross-domain mechanism. But maybe I don't understand. All the more reason to have her involved in the conversation.
Yeah, I think she needs to represent her use case.
Noted. Yeah, maybe we should say something about this. Okay, no more Q. We did talk about identity authorization chaining across domains in OAuth. There's some familiar faces there. And I do want to say I'm really sorry about RFC 8693 OAuth token exchange. It is indeed, and I've heard it described as a Swift Army knife that can be used in many, many ways. And that is true. But it is really, really, really not meant for, not intended for cross-domain usage. Please stop trying to use it that way. The RFC police will thank you. So that's all. Now what? I think some of this should be reflected somewhere, or maybe we can guide some people somewhere towards this. Maybe that goes in the architecture draft. Of course, that's what I think. Maybe nothing happens and I get off stage and we forget about this, but maybe there's some room in the architecture draft to guide some folks along this direction. Sorry, Joe. Maybe there's room for some kind of profile of 7523, that assertion grant and metadata. Maybe PICA lives in there somehow. That I'm less sure about, but it's certainly possible. Either way, I look forward to rooftop drinks in Bangkok, even though I don't drink. This is from the top of the Venue Hotel in Bangkok. Nice place. Hope to see you all there. That's all I got.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Joe, in the queue. We've got about a minute or so for questions and discussion.
Not bad.
Yeah, I would think at least part of this goes in the architecture draft or should influence what goes in the architecture draft. It seems very relevant. Yeah.
All right. So, Yaron, go ahead.
Sounds very much like a rechartering discussion to me.
Hi. So speaking as chair, and I don't see our AD. Okay. Thank you. I was like, you're not, Ori. But okay. So we got traded back by the ADs again, apparently. Speaking as chair, and the AD can correct me, a lot of the stuff that Brian addressed does feel like it's in charter. It's not within our current work items, though. It's well within the scope of what we said WIMSE was going to solve, but not necessarily what we signed up for to solve today. But that is something that the working group needs to consider. Is this where we want to put our energy and when?
I would add that the intent part of the charter is also specifically allowing this kind of discussion to happen and for the creation and evolution of these ideas. So I don't think we need to recharter at this point. I definitely want to encourage this discussion.
Yep.
Arnold.
So are you saying that we don't need to reach out so assuming we will want some profiles of something 7523, whatever, Pika, would that not be a recharter? I think it would be formally.
I think that we would need to see the proposed work presented to the working group, and we would evaluate it in the context of the current charter. Since that hasn't been done yet, we'll answer that question when we get there. Though, to Peter's point, having this discussion is very, very, very much in charter. So let's please absolutely have the discussion. Thank you for raising it. Art?
Schuster, I think the token exchange presentation and then later the BCP presentation will hit directly into that kind of curve, whether token exchange should be used, cross-trust domain and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're going to probably have discussion then, but I definitely see this in topic because literally every document, I believe, kind of talks about it. We have at the moment. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you. All right. And we're out of time. Joe. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
And okay, he's out of the queue. No, no, you should be fine. I can kick you off from here. I need to, now you pick which deck. And you should be good. Yeah, you got to confirm like 3 times. It's loading.
Confirm. Okay.
There we go.
All right.
All right.
So
take it away.
I hope you are all awake after lunch. I chose this nice color scheme to kind of keep you guys awake. Next slide, if we can make that happen. Okay, so we actually haven't had a lot of changes to the architecture spec since the last IETF. We've made some updates to the identity and trust domain definitions and added a little bit of text on some of the use cases. But kind of, I think we've been waiting for some of the other things to kind of develop more. I mean, service-to-service authentication has had a lot of work, which is where some of the identity stuff came from. But seeing how token exchange and other things are developing, I think as we see that stuff develop, it'll be a little bit easier to incorporate into an architecture. In addition, I really liked Brian's presentation and how it outlined it, some of that, because I think this is the type of information that needs to go in there. Unfortunately, we don't have that there yet, but I think that's kind of where we're looking at going with it. So in terms of workload identity, we've kind of reworked this definition. There's a similar definition or the same definition in the service-to-service spec. But basically, the identity is composed of a trust domain, an identifier for the workload, and then this information is encapsulated in a credential. And so if we look at the trust domain, basically the grouping of, this is kind of the definition that's in there. Certainly there's been some review of this, but looking for, more input on it. But basically we have a grouping of systems that make up a trust domain. We want that to be named something similar to a domain name, hopefully an actually registered domain name. But I don't think we can actually enforce that because that seems kind of a difficult thing to enforce. I mean, maybe we can put a must in there, but I don't know that anybody would be able to follow it and we wouldn't be able to verify it. So the trust domain itself, the main thing, one of the main things it does is it gives you a way to map to the type of credentials you use to verify the tokens that contain this information. So could be a root CA for if you're using X509 credentials, could be a JWK set if you're using JWT tokens. And really, if the trust domain is defining the scope of the token, if you have two names in different trust domains, then they're probably referencing different things. Could be that they reference the same thing, but you know, you would have to have some other information in order to make that correlation. Feel free to ask questions. I see puzzled looks. Okay. Maybe it might be obvious, like, you know, but I always feel like sometimes you need to state the obvious because people will get, you know, oh, I have the same name in both of these things, but I verified them using different credentials. You know, they're not necessarily the same thing, or I verified them in different trust domains, so they're not necessarily the same thing. Let's not get stuck on that.
Yeah.
There's a question in the queue. Do you want to take that now,
Yeah,
Joe?
we can take it now.
Ned?
Ed Smith, Intel. I was just wondering, you call it a trust domain. I just wondering if you could explain what the trust part means. How is it different from a regular domain, like a domain name?
So the I think where the trust comes in is the name is actually referring to the set of credentials that are going to be used to validate the verification information used to validate the credentials. So there's a trust relationship there in terms of how you are able to verify identity. Yes, different from DNSSEC. Yeah. Now, yeah, let's not go further down that path. Workload. So since we have defined a trust domain, we can now define what a workload identifier is. For those of you who are familiar with SPIFFE, this is going to be very reminiscent of what SPIFFE does. Basically, it's a URI format, and that's very convenient because it's something we can put within a URI SAN of a certificate, or we can put it in a JWT token. When we get to the service-to-service case, WIT is a specific type of JWT that we can use for authenticating between services. So the thing here is we made this right now. It's very flexible. It's sort of flexible. I mean, the format is you have to have a scheme and then a trust domain, which we defined in the previous slide. And then there's some path information, which is kind of specific to the scheme. There's a scheme already defined that matches that, and that's SPIFFE. We can define our own scheme. I'm not really sure if we want to do that or not. I'm kind of not really opinionated on that thing, but we can certainly, if we do, then we can have our own semantics with the rest of the identifier. I can take a question,
Gerdir.
Gerdir.
Gary Mundy, Qualcomm. Okay, MediaTek.
Just
Thank you. Thanks for reminding me. Do we envision for WIMSE alternatives to FQDNs? So, for instance, if I know I'm only migrating my workloads within machines that I own, could I use something like an equivalent of a local host for the trust domain and not bother with, not bothered with actually having something that can truly work cross domain?
I think the issue that we would have if you use a simple host name is that there's more chance of a collision, right? But if you're just talking about your internal domain here, then that may not be as big of a concern because you can avoid that issue. I think I don't think we say that it has to be a fully well, we do say it has to be fully qualified right now. So I think we could discuss that, but would it be is it a problem to make it fully qualified?
Well, I mean, it's, as I said, this is new,
Yeah.
right? We don't necessarily know. I could see deployments where you may not want to roll out FQDNs until you actually verify that this stuff works in practice. Then you can say, yes, let's make it truly cross-domain interoperable.
Yeah. Now remember that the FQDN part is for the trust domain part. So it's not necessarily each host has, or each service uses necessarily an FQDN. Right. The service is would be defined by that path part. So, and that may uses right now, that's locally defined until we decide if we want to have a format to define that. So, so I think we should have that discussion as to whether we want to allow non-fully qualified domains in there or not. I think the intent when we wrote this was that it would be fully qualified. I think SPIFFE requires fully qualified, but I'd have to go validate that because I'm not sure. And the intent here is that we would be compatible with SPIFFE, but it wouldn't necessarily, we could maybe extend it in a different way. And this is perhaps a little bit dangerous until we figure out how and if we want to coordinate with the SPIFFE folks, because it would certainly be bad if we diverged in incompatible ways.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I just want to point out we've got quite a queue growing, so we should.
Okay, I'm going to move to the.
Did you want to take the other three?
Yeah. Okay. If these are related, then let's take the other three.
Okay.
Fleming?
Fleming Andreas, you partially spoke to this already, but just on a question as to should we define a WIMSE scheme? I think it really comes down to, are you making any syntactic deviations or semantic deviations? And if you are, then we need to understand, why that is. You already alluded to the IP addresses potentially. There's obviously a lot of goodness if we could stay consistent, right, with SPIFFE, so we don't introduce something new. But at the same time, if we have good reasons for deviating, then let's understand what those are.
Yeah, makes sense.
Arndt?
Anshling Schuster. I believe the host part in URI is not required. So you could actually just have the path. And Kubernetes uses URNs, right? And they don't have the host path. And they actually make the assumption. Okay, maybe I'm not making sense.
So Justin Richer with chair hat off and have read way too much of the URI spec hat on. It's entirely dependent on the scheme. The scheme defines all of the subparts, and so the scheme defines whether or not there is even a host part or what that means. And so for a WIMSE scheme, we would define that. For something else like SPIFFE, it gets to define that.
Yeah.
Reason for the host part, to keep the host part in, is what you mentioned in the previous slide, that the same path with different hosts may not be the same, right? And if you cut off the host and you use the whole thing for authorization, you run into problems because you lose the context, right?
Yeah. And so with this particular scheme, what we're supposing here is that the scheme would always have a trust domain part to it because of that. You need to have that in order to validate the identity. Next.
Yaroslav.
Yaroslav, just remark, I don't think we anywhere mandate trust domain hostname or schema to be globally unique or publicly registered or something. So if you have a host specific use case, nothing stops you from using .internal, .intranet, or whatever you like it, as long, of course, as it is not conflicting with other things that you are communicating within your use case.
Correct. And that may be a reason why we don't want to have text that says we mandate it to be something registered, because that opens up a can of worms. Okay, I think we're free of the queue.
Yes.
And we'll go to the
4 minutes.
We'll go to the next slide real quick. This is kind of I'm reconnecting. Oh, so we have two types of credentials that we've been dealing with, at least in the service to service draft. We're talking about X509 certificates similar to SPIFFE SVIDs, and then a workload identity token, which is a bound JOT that can be used for service to service, key bound JOT that can be used for service to service authentication. We may also want to have some discussion of bearer JOTs and how they fit into the architecture or not, or what we recommend. But we don't have text around that at this point. One of the questions we have is, so we have this identity definition in both the service to service document and the architecture document. And Brian presented a software architecture principle that, what was the acronym? DRY. So don't repeat yourself. So we're repeating ourselves here. We should have it in one place. I'm wondering if we can remove that from the service to service spec and put it, reference the text in the architecture document. To me, that seems to be where it lives, but then that creates kind of a reference to the, a link to the architecture document, but I don't think that's a problem. But I wanted to see if people supported that or not. Fleming.
Fleming Andreessen, yeah, I fully support that. And further to what you were saying in the beginning, I mean, I do think we could probably tighten up what's in there right now. I understand that there's still work ongoing on all of these things, and we may have to improve it going forward. But yeah, let's keep it in one place. Architecture document seems fine from my point of view, and let's tighten up what's in there.
Does anybody think it should not go in the architecture document and be removed from, and just referenced from the service to servers authentication draft? All right, I think that's what we'll do with that.
The chairs would ask the editors to confirm that on the list, please. Thank you. We have Dimitri in the queue.
Okay, Dimitri.
Yeah, Dimitri Telegin. I quickly checked the transaction token spec, which like it should work in conjunction. Yeah, like
yeah,
with what
hopefully,
discussed today.
Yeah.
So they in that spec there is also a definition of trust domain, but it's less specific.
Mhm.
Okay.
And if those specs are indeed designed to work together, maybe we need some alignment.
Thank you. That's a great point. Thanks, Dimitri.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that. That's okay. The other new text in the document, there's some expansion on the use cases, not very much, but Ken provided some text to kind of help us get started with, the topics of impersonation and delegation and some of the asynchronous and batch processing stuff that we know we will have to cover at some point. Every time my phone goes to sleep, I have to wait for it to reconnect. So for the next steps, we're looking at, there's some open issues having to do with terminology and alignment with other WIMSE documents. And in addition to the WIMSE documents, I think things like that Brian brought up as being kind of in spec, like the transaction tokens, we need to kind of start aligning those terminologies to make sure that concepts, we either differentiate. If trust domain means something in transaction tokens, then we should move on. But hopefully we can get alignment on all the terminology. We should be working through a threat model. And I think one of the primary use cases that we need to start making progress on, which is kind of one of the fundamental ones, is kind of how authorization context and things like that get propagated through the spec. There's other things here we will continue to work forward, but we're definitely would like, contributions and discussions on these things are welcome. And it might make sense to try to schedule interim meetings or something to make progress on some of these items. Leave that open for you guys.
All right, so the chairs will take it as an action item to see if there is energy in the working group for an interim meeting around the architecture document specifically. And one of us will write that down.
Yes. Kathleen.
All right, can I have the next presenter get ready? I'm not sure which of the four of you is going to be presenting. Service to service document.
Yeah, I mean, did you have a question, Kathleen?
Yes, go ahead.
Comment, Kathleen
Yeah.
Moriarty. So for number 6, I have a draft in RATS that will either feed or solve that number 6.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, if you can send me a pointer, that would be awesome.
Yeah. After a couple more things get integrated into it, because there's been a lot of chatter on it this week. So I think it'll be helpful.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Whoever's presenting, please start presenting. Thank you. And Kathleen, if you wouldn't mind dropping a link in the notes to that draft, just the data tracker link. Or perfect. Oh, and it's moving. Okay. Sounds good. Looks like everybody is presenting. Okay.
I'm
Did you-
trying to ask for slides.
Yeah, I was about to.
Oh, sorry.
No, it times out. It's fine.
Okay.
No, I did not.
Okay. It disappeared as I was.
All right.
Okay, we're good. We're good.
Okay, so I'll let Brian introduce.
IETF 121, you all may recognize the building and the bridge. We're in Dublin, and we're going to talk about WIMSE service-to-service authentication. I like pictures, so you're forced to look at a picture. You want me to?
I can.
I don't know.
So since the last IETF, we've had a number of changes. We've obviously updated the identity section that we just talked about in the architecture section, so we can stop talking about that. But the main thing is we've been working towards being able to make a decision on how to do the proof of possession between HTTP signatures and this thing we call a workload proof token, or is it work?
Yep.
Yeah, which is similar to the Depop approach of proving possession. There's been some minor updates to the MTLS session and this section. We're still working through some of the GitHub issues. Yeah, so we just talked about the identity stuff. So for a recap, you put these back in. All right. Real quick, we're talking about how one workload authenticates to another, right? So this is within that environment. If you remember that picture that Brian had showed us earlier, we're inside of, say, a particular trust domain, and how does one workload authenticate to another? That's what we're trying to define here. There's a lot of things that we're not doing in this case. Like we're not dealing with cross domain for this particular use case. We're dealing within a particular domain. Yeah.
And single hop.
And it's a single, yeah, for the most part, a single hop. Although they're one of the things to discuss is if there could be some device in between that maybe we want to protect information going through. Do you want to talk about the WIT?
This is my part. So we define multiple ways how to do this service-to-service authentication. One of them is mutual to less. We'll have that in the end. And the other one is a more application level approach. And there we have two options, and later we can then have a discussion if you guys prefer one option or the other or both. In either of these two options, we have the WIT, the WIMSE identity token. It's a special type of chart. We have a type in here. And it requires a few claims: issuer, subject, expiration, identifier, and the confirmation claim. And this is not meant to be a bearer token. And for this reason, we've define a new HTTP header workload identity token where this is expected to pass in. And along with this token, there's always has to be some sort of proof that the owner is actually in possession of the key that is bound here in the confirmation claim. For those that have seen short SVITs from Spiffy, this differs in the way that we edit the issuer. Spiffy does not have it. The confirmation claim, and we removed the audience claim as this is not a bearer token anymore.
Yeah.
this is one of these options. So you would present the WIT from before in the workload identity token header. And then in this option, you would actually present proof also in the context of a token. We call it workload WIMSE proof token. I've heard someone say whip it.
Ooh.
Oh, I like it.
Yeah, but yeah, it wasn't me, but just yeah. So the whip it basically then is a token you would put on every request, and in that token you would then have, for example, have the ATH claim, the access token hash, if you would, for example, present that in combination with an access token, or a TTH, a transaction token hash, or WTH, which is the WIT token hash. So you would have your WIT over your session. There is no audience in it. You would just have one. And then along every request, whatever you sort of put context in it, what sort of audience you want to scope this to, you would kind of have a token you would kind of sign for every request. Yogesh, do you want to bring your question up now?
Yogesh Deshpande. One thing I wanted to ask, as you said, it is not a bearer token. Why do you have expiry there, and what does that reflect, and what is the significance of that?
It's a good question, but mainly like to keep it short-lived. For the on this one, I definitely see it like you don't want this to be replayed and so on, especially on this one. On the WIT, however, potentially you could remove it, but in generally I think it wouldn't be a good practice to have like
because my understanding is, so long as the workload exists, this identity should exist and should not change, right? Or maybe if
it's
I'm
an
just very
interesting
new to WIMSE, but
interesting
maybe wrong.
discussion. Yeah, there's probably a lot of implications if you remove it.
Yes.
But yeah,
Worth considering.
yeah, fair question. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to point out for clarity, this is the proof,
Yeah.
not the WIT.
We jumped slides here. There's
In
two
case that was
shots, like two tokens at the moment in play. Yeah, the WIT and the WIVIT.
right.
Yogesh. Sorry, Yaroslav.
It feels to me we have a little bit of redundancy or overlap here with some other work. For example, HTTP message signatures.
I just want to point out that is in this presentation.
Yeah.
And that
Next
was
slide,
brought up
please.
at the beginning. So
The other option is HTML with signatures. Thank you. It leverages an existing RFC where you would kind of provide integrity protection and a signature over a request. So from the bottom, here we have our workload identity token header. That's the first shot we presented. And then based on a signature and a signature input header, you would kind of provide a proof over the request. We have both of these options in the draft. Both of them have pros and cons. Between the authors, we have folks that prefer one side, folks that prefer the other side. I'm not sure myself. This is the reason I am the one presenting this. Yeah, can we go to the next slide, please? So since last IETF, we kind of made a comparison in the draft between the WIPIT and the HTTP method signature approach. What's important to note is that we are comparing apples with pears here, because they kind of solve different things. So the important thing for the WIPIT is that it's like less HTTP specific. So you can maybe use that for asynchronous communication. It's less complex because you would kind of use one stack. You would have jot and jot, not jot and something else. And it's easier to leverage for the same reason. You would just need one library. And you can also use that for non-HTTP protocols, for example, gRPC. On the HTTP method signature side, one more big important thing is that it provides integrity protection, right? So you with WIPIT, right? You could potentially change the body, for example, because we do not provide a digest or signature or whatever over the body. It's more like just proof of possession. Whether H method signatures, you can actually decide, and that is one of the pros here, you can decide how much part of the signature you want to have. Body and so on, includes response signing. It's more flexible, as said, and we are in that way resilient to rogue middle boxes because you cannot just replace the body as you would be able to with the Whippet.
Dean, you're in the queue.
I was trying to jump the gun.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wanted to give Arndt a chance to finish. Dean Sachs, is there a problem with doing both, right? And giving flexibility to the implementer to decide Whippet works for me, or HTTP-SIG works for me, or even using both if that is what is needed by the particular implementation?
Yeah, it's one of the options. It's more work for us. But yeah, it's perfectly fine, right? The question is like whether we should be opinionated about one, whether we allow for both, whether we just say profile the whole thing, right? Yeah, it perfectly valid. Like, yeah.
So I think reading the draft earlier this week, you have been opinionated about both, and you've said what the pros and cons are. You have it right here on the slide, and I think that is perfectly valid to keep them both in the draft and move forward with those considerations, because really it is up to the implementer to decide which one meets my specific needs. I can see reasons why you would choose either, and so I personally I would say don't choose one or the other. Leave both in place. And I'm sorry for the extra work, Brian, but leave both in place and then allow implementer to decide which one works best for their scenario.
Yeah, there's a few, I would say, interoperability questions, right? Like, for example, as a server or a client, would you need to support both? But yeah, of course, like yeah, if that's like, I'm curious what other opinions are, but if in general the working group says both, then this is the way we're probably going to go.
Right.
Yeah, I was also thinking along the same lines as Dean, partially because I see some, like when you say like, well, we don't need to protect the body and the HTTP signature provides that capability. I could imagine that there are easily cases where you actually want that type of protection because that's where some of the meat of the message is ultimately. I'm also in the meanwhile over the years gotten less sort of enthusiastic about this. Oh, this is more complex. This is less complicated. Here we can leverage implementation. Here we can't, because that is often sort of like changes so quickly in perception what simple and what not simple is. Like nobody ever started with a complex implementation or a complex specification. It just got more complicated over time. I heard Brian say today, like previously, for example, just to give you an illustration, the SD chart was previously advertised as simple, and now it's, I think you call it slightly simple, or I don't know. Relatively simple. So we already, but also the HTTP signature. This is not a complicated thing, right? We are talking about, at least was not back then, like when I last looked. And so I would be careful about sort of that type of stuff. But I see value in the flexibility because there will be different deployment use cases. And you can't, like that was already the problem to begin with HTTP signature. What do you include in the signature? Because that determines on what you protect against. And having one way to do it didn't cut didn't make the cut. And so you had to provide some flexibility in there anyway. So I think I'm with Dean. Long story short, Dean is right.
All right. So just as a time check, I want to point out we've got 3 more people in the queue. I'm going to recommend that we drain the queue before moving on. I've locked it so that we can hopefully move on. Thank you.
Hi, Fleming, just a quick comment. I think it's fine having multiple options. I do not think it is okay not to mandate one of those. You were alluding to that as well. Right? There's just all kinds of interoperability issues.
Thank you. Yaron.
I'm, well, obviously co-author on this. I also support one of the options, but regardless, I think we need to choose one because of the reason that Daryl cited in chat. You don't want people to make decisions they're not equipped to make, especially given that the people who implement the services are not the people who are responsible for the deployment in many cases. And so they don't even know if they do or do not have a middle box, for example. So let's pick one.
Thank you, Yarn. Kenneth.
Hi, Ken McCracken from Google. I wanted to point out that I recently created a GitHub issue asking whether the working group would consider workload proof by reference in the workload identity token. So changing sort of the definition of the CNF claim to refer to the transport layer. So I know the discussion at this point today has been about limiting the options, but I feel like building a workload identity token on top of an already established mutual TLS communication layer should be considered as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Let's continue.
All right. So go to the next slide, and the chairs have a poll that we're going to run to the room.
Yeah, I think we then also need to take this to the.
Yeah.
Sure. No,
that one's important.
I think this you better take.
Okay.
Just be
Yeah, we made some updates to the mutual TLS section, and basically recommending if you need to use, if you have elements in your system that need to validate a server cert, they may not understand the WIMSE or SPIFFE type of identifier, and so you may need to include both the DNS SAN and a WIMSE identifier in some of your certs, and that's okay in both the SPIFFE and in what we'd be specifying here. Obviously, validating trust domain is important. There's some discussion on EKUs, which we should take offline.
All right. So I think your next slide actually asks the question. So the chairs are going to start a poll. This first poll, unfortunately, the tool only gives us yes, no, and no opinion as options. So the first question is, do you support WIPIT, which I love the pronunciation, by the way, to being defined in this document? So I'm going to let that run real quick just to get a sense in the room as to what people feel about sort of these different pieces. We're going to also ask about HTTP SIG and mutual TLS. And we will, it seems pretty positive so far. I'm not seeing a no coming in as a dark horse here. So give that a second. I think somebody just voted no out of spite. All right. Nope, thank you. And we will, as always, we will confirm all of this on the list with a more robust poll. Do you support the definition of an HTTP SIG-based mechanism in this document? Notice that since these are different polls, you can vote yes twice, and that's totally okay, as per Dean's comment. You jumped out of queue. Okay. Fairly similar numbers here, at least that I'm seeing. All right. And finally, let me push the buttons. Do you support the definition of TLS X509 style definitions within this document? Everybody loves TLS.
Of course.
All right. Well, with this, all WIMSE work will now be ASN1 encoded. You didn't know what you were voting for, did you? All right. No, thank you. From my perspective, fairly positive for all three. So what we're going to do is we'll post to the list to basically get people's feelings of what combination and how they should be packaged together. So should this all be one doc? Should this be multiple documents? That's more conversation than we have time for right now. If we have time at the end, we can revisit that. You have 15 seconds if you want to touch anything else.
We'll take the rest of the discussion to the list.
All right. Thank you guys so much. And Dean, you are up next. Oh, wait, is the queue still locked? That's my bad. Okay. You should. gonna say. All right,
There we go. Cool. All right. Hello. I'm Dean Sachs. Kind of like the chairs. Thank you. I'm not quite as loud as Justin. Like the chairs, I also recently changed employers, so there was a slight delay in some of the work here on token exchange and translation. This is a picture from Kilmainham Jail. If you're here in Dublin, you should go. It's an awesome tour. I highly recommend it. There are daily tickets available like at 9 a.m. in the morning, which is the way you get them. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about token exchange and translation, some of the progress since IETF 120. Like I said, progress has been a bit slow between changing jobs and a really bad case of COVID. It took us a few months to kind of get back to this work. We did publish a recent update to the draft, an 01 version on October 21st. Thank you, Ken McCracken, who added the proposed X509 certificate to an access token profile. The fans of OAuth Token Exchange may say, hey, wait a second, this looks a lot like OAuth Token Exchange. I'm looking at you, Brian. Because it does, because that is a mechanism for token exchange that we might choose to use within WIMSE. I'm not sure that we need to define that specifically in this doc, but it does help us move our thinking forward, at least as we discuss this going forward. Come on, slides. There we go. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So I do feel like we are a bit stuck in neutral at this point in time. Wait, I think I maybe skipped a slide. Nope, I didn't. So we have started token exchange and translation office hours. We meet bi-weekly, where we've been working on two things in parallel. We've been working on our use cases document. Yaroslav has been leading a lot of that work. That is not intended to be published as an RFC, just so that we're all clear. We discussed that at IETF 120, I believe, but it does help us refine our thinking about what it is we are trying to achieve here. But there's a general sense amongst those of us meeting that OAuth Token Exchange, RFC 8693, can be used for many cases, but not all use cases, because we are not specifically limited to OAuth-style tokens within the work we're doing here in WIMSE. And so while that is a really useful set of tools, and maybe even a Swiss Army knife, as Brian said earlier, that Swiss Army knife is not meant for any cross-domain use cases, which may fall into token exchange and translation. By the way, for those who have not read the draft, the reason we are using the terms exchange and translation is exchange is high fidelity. You retain all of the information in an exchange, whereas translation, you may lose some information in that exchange, in that translation event. And we felt the need to define this because as we move between different types of tokens, token type A to token type B, and I'm being abstract here because all of this is kind of abstract, you may lose some information in that translation event, and it may not be possible to recover that information. And that may be okay for certain translation events. We just don't know yet as we are working through this. There have also been concerns raised around this work that if we use a generic mechanism like OAuth Token Exchange, that could result in downstream security impacts that are unpredictable. I think, Aaron, you might have made some mention of this in Brisbane, I think it may have been, or maybe in Vancouver. And so we do have to kind of keep this in mind as we do this work moving forward. I see we have some folks in the queue. Questions?
Hi, this is Hannes. I was wondering whether you can explain a little bit on what you mean by we are not tied to OAuth sort of tokens, and OAuth tokens are JWTs, right? And
sure.
So or what do you mean by that? Let's say that.
Well, I think we need to consider the fact that we have like SPIFFE SVIDs, which are a type of token that we can use. It is not necessarily, we're not necessarily going to go from an SVID to an OAuth access token. Maybe we're going from an SVID to some X509 or some other combination. And we're just trying to be a bit loose in what we're defining here because we don't know yet what all the token types we might see are going to look like. And in fact, this makes this work incredibly difficult because it is very, very open-ended. And we are, much like 8693, defining a Swiss Army knife. And it is somewhat of an unbounded Swiss Army knife. Or if you're a fan of The Simpsons, it kind of looks like Homer's car that he built. It's going to have a bit of everything in it. Thank you for laughing. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think it helps. I was just it was such a generic statement that I wasn't quite sure whether you refer or that the reference to Spiffy regarding like X549 and call them that as a token as well helped me.
And yeah, I mean, this is again, it is extremely open-ended, and that is one of the most challenging parts of all of the conversations that we're having, is the open-endedness of it. And if you'll give me a second, and Ned, I see you here, and I'll get to you in a second. If you give me a second, I will get to how we start to bound this in some way, and that's going to be on our next slide. Go ahead, Ned.
Yeah, so I believe you said this is in the context of domain crossing.
It may be within a domain, it may be crossing domains. We will hopefully be able to support both use cases. But again, very open-ended. And there are, Yaroslav, remind me, it was 9 use cases that we defined. 9 use cases that we defined in a draft that we shared in Vancouver that define the kinds of operations we expect. So it could be changing from, my username, my personal username, Dean Sachs, to my work username, which might be Dean.Sachs, or it could be changing token types. It could be changing encryption types, etc. I encourage you to read that use cases doc.
Okay, so in the context of domain crossing and translation, one assumes that the tokens are signed, and so that means that information in them is kind of bound to that signature. And if translation means you're going to change what's inside the token, then you need to re-sign it with something, in which case you need to start talking about a lot about what is the trusted entity between the two domains.
Yes. And this, I think we will get to in the next slide, because one of the outstanding questions we have, and if I can get to the next slide, I will do this, is about how do we, in concrete terms, come on, here we go. How do we, in concrete terms, define what this looks like? And so broadly, we've come to the agreement that we need to develop some kinds of profiles. This doc can define what a profile needs to include, what a profile might look like. And in fact, I'm working on putting together some verbiage that helps us write those profiles in an RFC style format. But we need to, in concrete terms, be able to say from token A to token B, or token type A to token type B, what that transformation looks like, what that exchange or what that translation looks like, and what the implications are of any data loss that may occur. And those may be internal to a trust domain, they may be across a trust domain, but we need to begin defining these as profiles so that we can have very explicit mechanisms to make these exchanges or translations, as opposed to the some magic occurs. And this is where we go from an sort of an unbounded Swiss Army knife to a very finely honed sushi knife or santoku or whatever your knife of choice is. But that's where I think the next step of this work goes.
Right. So I think the important point is that there should be an authority context in which those profiles are developed and agreed upon. That you're basically creating the contract, kind of like a legal contract between the two entities. And there's lots of ways to do that. And you could get into situations where you are relying on some non-existent trusted third party because the signaturing requires it, but in reality, there's no trusted third party, right?
Well, hopefully we don't wind up in that situation where there is no trusted third party. In an ideal world, all of these exchanges and translations happen between trusted parties, whether they're inside of a single trust domain or across trust domains, because we have to establish trust between multiple trust domains.
Right.
But I would love to explore this more with you on the list.
Okay.
Thanks. All right, so continuing on. What we think we would like to do, and this is where I would love to invite some further discussion, is create profiles as RFCs, because we believe that and this was in conversation with the chairs as well, that this ensures some process rigor, it ensures clear definitions. We can reduce the optionality in the implementations by defining them as RFCs. And these profiles should be unidirectional, because the profile from token type A to token type B, or the exchange or the translation, may be different from the opposite direction. And so we may build them as pairs where you have A to B and B to A written at the same time. We may do them independently, but ultimately we need to define what this looks like based on real types of tokens that people want to do exchanges or translations with. And this is where I invite your help to give us some input as to what that is going to look like. What pairs of tokens are you going to exchange or translate, or which of the use case operations are most important to the people here in this room and online, because that is going to help us really begin to move forward. Along with that, we need to really ask the question, should we develop profiles that cover the RFC 8693 OAuth token exchange? Because like Brian said, Swiss Army knife, it's fairly open-ended. And do we need to put some bounds around that for some of these exchanges or translations? Sorry, Justin, dropping your drink over here. And as we begin putting these profiles together, another question we need to ask is, should they be composable? So should you be able to go from token type A to token type B to token type C in some composable manner? And what are the security considerations as you do that? If you're losing fidelity, say, in the information in those tokens, is that acceptable? And if it is, what are the security considerations of those exchanges or translations? And so this is where we need some additional help. We invite you to come to office hours with us to talk about this, or on the list, or in and as well in GitHub, to be able to really move this work forward. So I'll put the office hours calendar up here. You can join this calendar. I learned the hard way about sending meeting invites to the list. My apologies to everybody. But we would invite you to come join us. And if you can't get the QR code or you have some troubles, just let me know. I'll send you the link so that we can figure out where we go from here. I see we have some folks in the queue. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, go ahead, Yaron.
I would suggest that we include 1 or 2 real profiles in this document, at the very least, to prove out the template. So even if it holds the document, I think there's a lot of value in having real profiles.
I agree with you. I think, and what I started working on this week, I haven't finished, is putting together what that that profile document in an RFC style format looks like, to help authors along, to speed that development, because I want to make sure that it doesn't take us a year or 2 years to develop each and every profile, because that would be a bummer for all of us here. It would not be beneficial to us. So anything we can do to speed that up would be helpful. I do agree, Yaron, it would be helpful to put them in this document. However, what I might offer is, early in the development, we put them in this document so that we can talk about them, and then we break them out into their own separate draft as an RFC, or maybe run them side by side. I would look to the chairs for advice on what they would prefer in this case, to, again, move this work forward as quickly as we can, but with rigor.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Yaron.
All right, Mitchell. I'm in. Oh, he requested to present slides. Sorry, there was somebody else in the queue from the chair's perspective. Hi. So speaking as non-chair, but as a general process comment for something like this, it would be a potential path for this work to progress the concrete profiles as their own individual documents, but keep the template just as a resource that informs and shapes those going forward. So I don't think that we need to wait until the template is like finalized as an RFC before we start using it.
I think that's a fine choice, Justin. Would we then make the publication, if we get to this point, of those profiles or working group last call of those profiles, would we make that a dependency on working group last call of this primary document as well, so that they move forward with one another?
I was proposing that the primary document need not even necessarily be its own separate artifact.
Okay.
Depending on how much value there is in that layer of abstraction.
Fair enough. Sounds good to me.
So I think it's a design pattern that for document delivery that should be considered with this work.
Great. Thank you very much.
Peter Castleman speaking as non-chair. I was kind of curious if you had any sense at this point about concrete examples, right? This feels like a very abstract discussion right now. And I'm not sure we need document templates as much as maybe something specific that, I'm curious, looking at the use cases, was there any of the use cases that sort of popped out that said, this is the one we should go do? Or is that something that you maybe want to get feedback on even?
It's a fantastic question, Peter. Thank you. I think getting some feedback again from this group as to which token exchange or token translations are most important to this group, looking at the use cases, looking at the kinds of tokens that people want to use, I think it's going to be really helpful and instructive to determine which ones we build first. As I noted earlier, Ken McCracken did do some profiling work around X509 to an OAuth access token. That was certainly very helpful. But if there are other examples that we can use or that people can help put in place with us, that will help really move this work forward much faster.
Fleming.
Yeah, just Justin, disagreeing a little bit with you. I do think actually there's a lot of value in having a document, a formal document that outlines what are the things you want to see in one of these profiles and what are the steps that you have to go through. And the reason for that is that you end up streamlining it so it can go a lot faster and you don't hopefully compromise the security in the process of doing so. So, I mean, to me, it's like, extensions and other documents, right? There are things that you have to make sure get specified. And I do think we want to have some rigor to that process here as well.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. One more question from me, Dean. I'm curious.
As chair or
as not as chair.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
So in terms of the exchange, right? So have you sort of any thoughts on when is it, when you're requesting a access token, or any sort of principles around, well, if I'm requesting an access token, that's really an OAuth profile. Or if I'm requesting a certificate, that's really a certificate issuance a protocol that may already exist, right? So I'm just sort of curious how you think about avoiding, or if you're concerned even about using token exchange as sort of a way to obtain credentials that maybe could be or should be obtained through existing protocols.
So we have not written that down per se in the doc. However, I think that is a fantastic call out, and we do need to write more around that specific concept, because we shouldn't bind people to just what is in this doc. If they have other mechanisms that exist and that work and can fit into their use cases, then workloads should be able to use those, right? So we shouldn't constrain that per se. However, if there is a need to then say compose multiple sets of token exchange or translation into a chain of events, we may wish to then profile that so that we can understand exactly what steps are happening and what security implications fall out of that. That is a fantastic idea. I would love it if you would drop an issue in GitHub on that to remind me when I get back to my desk to go work on that issue.
All right. So just real quick, Justin speaking as chair, to remind the group that we don't constrain people doing anything that they want to outside of this working group. What we can do is give people the guidance and advice for how things within this group will interoperate. And so that is an important framing for if there are other token mechanisms that don't fit inside this, we're not going to stop you. Yogesh.
Yogesh, just very brief. You have a use case document, right? You mentioned?
Yes, there is.
So maybe you can explain some interoperability of certain profiles and stuff already in that rather than creating a new document?
It, I don't know that it fits directly into the use case document that we have, but we can certainly take a look at that. I will remind everybody there is a side meeting tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, to talk about the use cases. So I would encourage you to show up and join us there, and we can have the conversation there.
Thank you.
All right. And Brian, real quick.
I think it's clear we both have some reservations about token exchange and applicability here, the actual RFC. But I think, to pun a little bit, something's lost in translation somewhere, because I think our reservations are pretty different, or at least my understanding of it. And I will just leave with, whatever you do here, please stop going cross domain. That should not be a use case for this, because it's already addressed with other specifications. And if those are inadequate, let's look at that.
Okay.
But don't reinvent it because it already exists.
I have heard quite clearly from Justin on many occasions this week about not reinventing wheels that already exist. That is not the intent here. However, this space is deep. And if I have missed something, then please point me to it, or point the other people in the office hours to that, so we can take a look at that and figure out, is there something we need to do here, or is there prior art that we can look to and say, go do that instead, because we don't need to reinvent this wheel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dean.
So I actually had already closed the queue because we are over time.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Art. Yeah, about 20 minutes. I mean, I'm trying to kick people off pretty close to time. So I'll give you a timer in a sec.
So first of all, thank you, Brian, Dean, Joe, for preparing me the stage, because I'm going to talk about everything we've heard so far.
You got to select. Yep, there you go.
And that is former best practices for workload identity. Now it's informational for workload identity. We'll come to the name at the very end, right? And I will also not take questions in the middle, because there's 5 different discussion points I want to get through. Yeah, since last IETF, we have agreement to move to informational rather than BCP, best current practices, and also to document current practices without strong recommendations. The current document and data tracker is still the old version, because we wanted to get first feedback before we merge the PR. You can find the editor's copy under this QR code, which is now on the top right. So previously in our old scope, we just talked about Kubernetes, very popular workload platform. In the new scope, we added more to it. So we added SPIFFE as workload platform, or like workload entity platform. We also added cloud providers like GCP, AWS, and Azure. We added CI/CD platforms like GitHub, Jenkins, and GitLab. And also something to think about while I talk, if you have other workload platforms that should be reflected there, please let us know. To Kubernetes. I'm going to talk about all of these different platforms and how they kind of solve workload identity. I'm not going to get into detail. Yeah, so with Kubernetes to start with. So in the first step, most of the time, the Kubernetes API controller, aka kubelet, schedules the workload. And then technically in the same step, sometimes outside, it also projects a service account token, which is signed by the Kubernetes control plane into that workload. So you have a trust domain in this Kubernetes cluster, and workloads can, for example, use that to, again, talk to the control plane, to talk to each other, and so on. But what often is happening is that there is some external authorization domain. For example, your Kubernetes pod needs to upload something to an S3 bucket. And in that case, there is a specific flow that repeats itself across all platforms. And that is the workload presents the projected service account token to an authorization server. In the steps, I call it present assertion. The authorization server has some sort of trust already pre-established, and it returns an access token. And with that access token, the workload can then access protected resource, or off term, aka, like in my case, an S3 bucket in the external authorization domain. Did I skip one? No. Okay.
It's a little slow.
With cloud providers, very similar flow. The workload would first get its identity from something that is commonly called as instance metadata service, instance metadata endpoint. And all of these endpoints, it's under a loopback domain, return directly to the workload and access token. And in A1, you can use that access token to access protected resources within the cloud. It's like this typical pattern, go to any cloud providers, I want to connect my database or any sort of resource with my VM, Kubernetes cluster, whatsoever. This is how it works. But often your scenarios may be cross-cloud, or you want to access a resource that has a different authorization domain. For example, a different AWS account whatsoever. And in that case, you would do the same thing. You would, whatever you get back from instance metadata service, would present that as an assertion, that's step B1, to an authorization server. With federation pre-established, would get an access token back, and with that access token, B3 access the protected resource, for example, in a different cloud. Spiffy, similar pattern. You have a workload platform, can be anything, VM, Kubernetes, whatsoever. You have a workload, and you can, with that workload, can get a short SVID from the Spiffy workload API. And with that short SVID, you can present that as an assertion to an external authorization domain, cloud provider, something on premise, get back an access token. With that access token, access an external protected resource. And last but not least, the ICD. You have a task workload, often called pipeline, step, action, whatsoever. All of these are scheduled by the CI/CD pipeline or platform. And while they're scheduled or in between, these tasks can get an identity from that platform, for example, a JOT token. And workload or like task pipelines can use a JOT token, for example, to perform a deployment. Imagine like typical GitHub action, deploy something into Azure or whatever, or wants to upload a build artifact. And the same flow happens, right? That task would present that token it got from the CI/CD platform as an assertion to the authorization server, get back an access token. With that access token, upload something, start a deployment. So what we're doing in this draft, we are documenting this common pattern you would see across all workload platforms. So you would have some workload platform, and you would either get a credential issued from that platform, either push to the workload, or you can pull it directly or request it from the workload by the platform. You would present that token or credential as an assertion to the authorization server. You would get back an access token, and with that access token, actually eventually access the protected resource. So the current draft outlines this common pattern, and the different platforms that I've talked about, they are all in the appendix. Yeah.
Just for clarification, current draft, do you mean the editor's draft that's in
Yes.
the PR, or
yes,
which?
That is in the PR.
In the PR. Thank you.
In a bit, I will have a probably poll whether the working group believes this new scope is valuable, or we should just keep the old scope with Kubernetes.
I'll get that ready.
In this common pattern, I always talk about present assertion, and you get back an access token. I lied because it smells like an assertion, it feels like an assertion, but it is not. And that is that picture trying to represent. If you've been around after the pub or generally in Dublin, there's like these doors, different colored. They're all doors, but they look different. And that's the same with this flow I described here. So different providers use different things. So token exchange by Google, assertion flow by Azure, and AWS has something, assume role with web identity, I think it's called. Yeah, so this is like kind of, it's not interchangeable. All of these flows have their own SDKs, their own kind of means to do this. Yeah, I believe, yeah. There's now a few security considerations that kind of we have in mind to describe for this. So for example, how do you validate that sort of platform issued credential? In most cases, it's issuer, subject, and audience, but there's also situations. I think on the third point, I describe it there. Custom clients are important for context. For example, if you use a CI/CD pipeline, it is very important to make differentiation between the main branch or developer branch, right? You might want to have the main branch allowed to deploy into production, but not a developer branch. There's different token types, right? Do you just present an access token? Do you present an ID token? Do you present something different? We talked about a OAuth OpenID logout token, right? At the moment, I believe all of those would be accepted. Maybe not a good idea. Lifetime, workload, life cycle, when the workload stops, do we invalidate the token and so on? So there's a few security consideration, and each of these platforms do different things. Some of them do pretty cool things. So for example, in Kubernetes, when the workload stops, the token gets invalidated. Yeah, proof of possession, etc. I'm glad this slide survived the previous conversations. Where, that's my personal opinion, where I see similarity with other work. So this document is talking mainly about the assertion flow, even though some use token exchange and other things. We have ID chaining, which is also talking a bit about the topic and kind of combines those two. And we also have this translation exchange design group. And I believe the interoperability between those is that if I have a platform issued credential, but it doesn't fit what my cloud provider wants or my external authorization server. And in that case, we may need sort of some translation. Like I have a token or credential, maybe an X509 certificate, but I need an OAuth assertion. So I need to kind of get that exchanged. Yeah. Should we train the queue first and then maybe do the poll?
Yeah, sure. I had locked it because you said you didn't want questions until the end. So yeah, let's go right ahead. Mohammed, you are up first.
Samati Dresden. In the comment pattern, you mentioned that you have a workload identity already. And my question would be, firstly, do you assume that it's within the same platform which you show as the work platform? Can it come from outside? And the second question would be that there is a trust assumption that you have between the external authorization domain and the workload. What is the kind of connection between the two? I assume you are kind of assuming that there is a trust relationship, which I heard that you say, but I'm trying to understand, like, is there a TLS connection which is kind of protecting this communication, or what kind of visualization do you have for this trust relationship to hold?
Okay. So for your first question, it can potentially come from outside the workload platform. For example,
that would already be a problem, right? So if it is coming from outside, you still need to protect that communication.
It depends on the pattern. So for example, in Spiffy, it may get signed from something completely else, but it is in the end a trust domain in here. Maybe the term is not correct, but it is a different domain than the one you're trying to.
Yeah, but it's, if it's coming from outside, I mean, I could have obtained the identity and I could, as a man in the middle, use that identity to present myself as what that identity was, for whoever that identity was meant to be.
Yeah.
How do you protect in that kind of case when it is coming from outside?
It really depends on which platform you use.
Yeah.
And I would put that out of scope.
I think it's an important security consideration.
Can you put that as an issue into the repo, because then we can have a look at it and think whether we should talk about this in the document or not.
Okay.
And your other question is that trust relationship between the thing that signs the credential issued by the platform and the external authorization domain up here is made out of band, and every sort of authorization server, whether it's AWS, Azure, Keycloak, whatsoever, has their own means of establishing that sort of trust relationship.
Yeah.
Also something we could talk about. Feel free to create an issue. I at the moment I don't have any sort of opinion if that.
So you are open to any kind of protocol which is protecting this communication, but you assume that there is something which is protecting it. Is it correct?
I'm not sure I fully get it now, but let's talk about this offline.
The question was, is there TLS between the boxes?
Which box? But
External authorization domain and the workload platform. Is there TLS in between these two?
like 2 and 3.
2 and 3, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. you
So
would
there
have-
is TLS in between the two.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
But maybe we should be explicit about it, right? So
Sure.
just write it into the issue and we'll
Yeah.
have a look. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
This is Joe Salloway. Let's see. So do you run into the scenario where there's an authorization server also within the workload platform domain? So that is it always a direct trust relationship between the credential that's issued to the workload and the authorization server in the external domain? Or do you have a case where there's, say, a token exchange or token translation between the two?
Between workload and workload platform authorization server or workload and the
Yeah,
external
so that is the external authorization server always, like, for example, in Kubernetes, is the external workload authorization server always processing a token directly for Kubernetes, or do you have cases where you have a translation within the Kubernetes domain to, because the one concern I have is sometimes there's a little bit of a manageability issue in that, like, the things in Kubernetes go and come, they just disappear and come back, and it can be difficult to coordinate that externally. I mean, some of the things may not be so hard because they're all in the same environment, right? If you're using EKS and AWS or various things, right, then that can maybe be coordinated very easily. But in other cases, it may not be. And I'm just wondering if you've seen a pattern where there's or if it's interesting to have a pattern where there's maybe two authorization servers, one in the local domain, workload domain, that helps account for these differences.
So whoever signed this credential is, in my opinion, some sort of authorization server, right? And yeah, it's again maybe something for as an issue. I'm not sure if this pattern exists, but I'm not sure if I heard of it. Yeah. Hannes?
I wonder whether we lost something when we sort of with the workload platform box and omitting the host box, which is essentially where the workloads are running on, because now we also lost the agent in doing that. We abstracted that away. That's maybe something we should think about. I thought that was important for specifically the issue of, maybe that's something we should rather deal with in the architecture document, but the notion of how does the workload actually get the initial token through the different mechanisms, whether that would be environmental variable and so on and so on. Yeah, that was one thing to probably worthwhile to spend some time on. The other one is on the diagram, the Venn-like diagram that you had a little bit later. There, I thought I would have drawn the circles. If you go to that, I don't know if that's this one. I would have actually included at least part of the token exchange there as well. Also because of the fact that the assertion flows, they are a means to do the client authentication to the token exchange. And via that, you kind of get the token exchange story in there, in my opinion. But obviously, like,
this is my personal opinion. I just kind of wanted to kind of bring that in here, but yeah, let's please not get stuck on it.
Fleming Andreasen, if you go to the slide about the new direction, I'm not sure I understand the new direction. What is that referring to? I mean, are you going to include all these scenarios in there, or are you just going to take the common pattern, or what is the proposal here?
So before we just talked about Kubernetes and specifically about Kubernetes, how Kubernetes internally, kubelet, etc., provides that projected service account token. With the new direction, we kind of went away from just Kubernetes, described the whole pattern, and also about how that sort of assertion smells like, I just talked about, right? There's a few other questions which kind of point to whether we want to go in that direction or not.
But are you still planning on having all the individual scenarios described in this document? Is that what the new direction is?
Appendix. They are in the appendix. We can potentially put them also in the normative section. I don't mind. I'm not.
Okay, because the common pattern Yeah, to me, that seems more like overall architecture, right, in terms of where we would then want to go. I thought what we had concluded in the previous meeting was essentially the appendix that you were describing. And if we are trying to come up with a list of scenarios, that would obviously help for the token translation and exchange, informing what are the scenarios we want to focus on. I would probably add to the list as well, VMware, right? I mean, there's a lot of it out there, right? It's not going to go away anytime soon.
All right, so we are out of time for this topic. I know you had a bunch of polls that you wanted to ask. Work with the chairs. We'll make sure that these get put out to the list. I encourage you guys to look through the slides. There are some very good questions about what are the appropriate next steps of this document. The biggest one, which has already been asked for the list on the list, is please go read that pull request and familiarize yourself with the new content. It is a significant change. Who here in the room has read the pull request version of the draft? Okay, handful of people. I'm gonna kindly request that more people go read through that. There's a lot of stuff in there, and this is an important part of the document, figuring out sort of what it is as a document. So, yeah. All right, thank you, Mark. Okay, and for the final presentation, we have Ryan. I think he's remote, right?
Ryan's remote, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Ryan, are you going to present slides from there? If you're online, I hope.
I am online, sorry.
No worries.
Thank you for joining us early.
So it's actually preferred if you present the uploaded presentation instead of sharing your screen.
Okay, and unfortunately, I don't know how to do that.
There's a weird icon that looks like a page that's crossed out. Or I can run it from you here. There you go. That's it.
Okay, I see.
And then you pick your talk from that list. It's a much more efficient screen share. Excellent. Yeah. And you should have full control. Thank you.
Magical. I didn't think to add the QR codes when I put this together, so I will follow up with links and email as well to the list. But this is a follow-up to the conversation at Vancouver this last cycle, where we discussed the idea of having a document that talked about workload authentication maturity levels, a taxonomy for practitioners and organizations to sort of rationalize all of the different choices that exist in this space. It's actually perfect that I followed Art, because there are a lot of sort of abstract properties that I think that are somewhat hard to reason about, not from necessarily an implementation level, but from like the security properties and sort of how does this all fit together inside of an organization that might have a lot of different systems doing a lot of different things and wanting to be able to understand sort of, again, the maturity level across those systems for how they're adopting workload authentication or not. And so as I walked away from our conversation last week, the goals that I understood that seemed to resonate were that we would look at creating a structured approach for talking about this problem domain, much like was done with 863B. I think while that document lacks a lot of specificity and leaves the door open for different implementations, which I think is a positive trait. I think it's done a lot for the industry to enable customers and organizations and practitioners to talk about the larger problem. And so goal-wise, sort of creating a similar style framing is kind of where I think it makes sense for the project to go, and really to help not just practitioners, but organizations understand how to progressively improve their security posture through identifying the work that's happening in this working group and understanding, how it all fits together at a higher level, and to really provide a common language to be able to talk about this, so practitioners and organizations can make a informed decision. So a initial draft has been submitted. I think the final document won't look anything quite like this, but it does get across the ideas of sort of directionally where the hopefully, or at least based on where we are now, the thinking is that this will go. My takeaway from both the thread that happened in the mailing list, as well as the conversations that took place in Vancouver, that there seems to be some consensus that there's maybe a there. We've gathered some initial feedback and have a potential structure to get started for on the content. And I bamboozled Jeff Lombardo to join in this path to help make sure that this makes progress quicker, and it's not just my own view of things, and as things go forward, we're still looking for additional support. There's been some really good conversation today, or actually yesterday, from Dean. Thank you very much. And so, speaking of which, the feedback that we've received so far does not list Dean's feedback here, but I'll touch on that a little bit as well. The sort of focus being, we need to take this existing document and replace the current outline, make it much clearer, and talk about the purpose that we've just discussed here, realign so it looks, at least in this context, the current thinking is to make it align more with 863 in structure, so that those familiar with that document can work through it, and we can benefit from the learning from that exercise. We have no security section today, and we don't. To Dean's conversation on thread, we don't talk about security properties that are sort of we'll call it a third dimension in the problem, like are these tokens somehow bound to hardware, and not so. Figuring out how to thread the needle for keeping it a high level document that is useful for understanding these the different approaches, or not so much approaches, but assurances that are offered, while providing useful and not misleading security description. Is going to be probably one of our biggest challenges in this exercise. Anytime you try to come up with a taxonomy, you run into that adage of some models are wrong, versus all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And so I think that's going to be our challenge. Right now, there's 6 levels in the document as I was putting it together. It'd be nice to get that down so it's not so many, so it's a little simpler for people to understand. Talk about, make sure it's clear that there's a distinction between workload and human identity requirements. And I think a lot of that can be dealt with in the objectives. And, again, to Dean's conversation on thread, is it would be useful for us to have some normative language and just in general consistent language that we can adopt, so that this might be a useful document to capture some of that, so that we can reduce the friction of it, understanding the broader work that's being done, and define requirements. And again, I think this comes back to a little bit to Dean's conversation on thread about the supporting authentication elements and what properties we are looking for out of each one of them, and making it clear that it'll vary implementation to implementation, because I don't think we can boil the ocean and have and be successful in accomplishing at least the taxonomy goal. So the current draft has been uploaded. It is also in my GitHub at this URL. I sent an email out with some conversation on it, which summarizes these slides. We will be setting up an office hours, and I'll send the details for that to the list so folks can join and comment as time and interest exists, and hopefully we'll start to be able to have something more substantive to talk about in the next IETF. So this is all I had for today. Any thoughts, comments?
All right. So as a reminder, this is not currently work in the working group. So with that framing, Dean, go ahead.
Hey, Ryan, thanks again for the work you and Jeff have put into this. I'm happy to see progress being made. One of the things that I didn't say on the thread last night, but that came to mind as we were talking today is when we write RFCs, those are static documents, relatively speaking. They live for a very long time unless you author something that updates them. How does that impact the utility of defining workload authentication maturity levels if they are fixed in time and space? Is there a plan for how to deal with this in, say, 2 or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years when the maturity levels that are defined today are no longer really useful? You know, we have BIS documents and other ways to do this, but I would encourage you to really think about that because it may at some point no longer be a useful construct, at least in the way it's written today. And I'm not sure what the right mechanism is, and maybe the chairs have some input or the ADs have input on that, or Anna has input.
It's a good thought. I mean, my thought there, you know, sort of viscerally is that we, you know, protocols themselves, what are secure and is not, sort of change over time as well. So I think the existing process, my original thought was that this would be an informational that might get updated via the BIS process. But.
Hi, this is Hannes. I think the answer is relatively simple, luckily. You need to abstract away from specific solutions and then like think about, like you mentioned in your presentation, if you distinguish between, for example, storing private keys in software, like in operating system, file system, versus storing them in hardware, that is likely a concept that will not change in the next few years. And so you get away with sort of the details that age, unfortunately, do well. The other comment is like, I couldn't find the document other than on your GitHub repository. Did you submit it already? And if you haven't, please use draft, then and also an indication for the WIMSE group in the file name so we can actually find it.
I did upload it. But I think it's in a review queue. I'll make sure it gets showed up, and I'll make sure it's tagged appropriately. Thank you very much.
Feel free to reach out to the chairs if you need a hand poking at data tracker. It can be weird at times.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. One more. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I did not add myself to the queue on the.
I can see that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Gary Money of MediaTek, and maybe Dean might have some thoughts on this too. Just my experience in the RATS working group, when we tried to, you know, in disclosure, I'm co-editor of Entity Attestation Token, which is currently in the RFC Ed queue. We tried to bring in security assurance levels into the attestation token, and that was actually I modeled that off of the FIDO security certification levels, which actually are meant to be able to map to AALs as defined in 800-63. We had to rip that out. Problem was that from a relying party perspective, that just looked like a self-declaration and really was meaningless. Are you thinking that you may enrich authentication tokens in the WIMSE context with these with these assurance levels? And if so, how would the relying party actually be able to make use of them when they look like self-declarations potentially?
My thought was no, for that reason. Actually, I think it's there's a lot of, we're having a lot of conversations in the working group on how we bring in the different patterns that are being adopted in this space. And when in my customer conversations, I'm finding it's hard for customers to understand, like, what are they getting in these different patterns, and so they can reason across them. And so the idea is that I think this is a textual document, not a protocol document. And any decision to adopt anything like that into an individual protocol would be orthogonal to that.
Ditto for you, Dean.
Okay. So I do want to point out we are just about out of time. We've got a couple of things we need to wrap up. I encourage folks to continue this discussion on the list. There's already a thread that's started in reference to this document, but please continue on. So, and thank you, Ryan. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us here at WIMSE. I have written down 3 actions for the chairs that we're going to be following up on soon. First is we're going to be scheduling an interim for the architecture document with the various fall and winter holidays coming up. That's going to be a little bit tricky, but we'll try to find a good spot. It might be January. It depends on how and where the architecture folks think would be a good fit between now and where's the next one? Bangkok? Bangkok, thank you. Between now and Bangkok, we'll find something. Second, we're going to have put out a formal poll for the service-to-service presentation and security mechanisms, as was requested here. We will put out a formal poll to the list about what people want to do with that. As a preview, part of this option is going to be, is it pick one? Is it pick all? Is it something else? You know, something along those lines. And finally, Arndt actually had a lot of questions at the end of his presentation we weren't able to get to. I counted 5 total in the end here. So work with us. We'll figure out how to phrase those and bring those formally to the list to get people's feedback on sort of what the direction we want to go for that. As a reminder, though, please read the pull request, and I encourage the editors to move forward with editing the document, even if we don't necessarily have everybody saying, yes, go do this exact thing right now, because it's been my experience that oftentimes you need text to get people mad at to go find the right text afterwards. So that is how rough consensus is often built. So I encourage you guys to do that. Don't wait for that to, I mean, you can go merge it now. It's fine. That's up to you. With that, any other business folks that want to bring up? We've got a couple minutes left. Yeah, go ahead.
Fleming Andreas. Yeah, so just real quick. So I missed the email basically pointing out, right, that there was a whole pull request. My bad. It just would be good if, I mean, is there a reason why we can't just submit the document and then people can look at it, and if they don't like it?
That was a timing thing. It was very close to the cutoff when Arndt basically did the edits, and so I'm encouraging them to just put the draft in now, so that we can do that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That would be
I will say though that the GitHub tooling does give you a fully rendered version of the doc. We're not asking you to read a diff.
Understood. I missed it, right?
Yep.
I go to the usual places. My bad.
No, totally okay. And that is part of the reason why I'm encouraging you guys to do the draft. Drafts are cheap.
I agree with all that. And also, if you're in close to a meeting and you still want to get an update out, we can approve them through the embargo. So although you get blocked, we can just say, go ahead if that's what the chairs want. So just ask.
All right. Thank you. Good to know. And I appreciate you volunteering Ori for that. All right, go ahead, Art.
I didn't want to mess with the scope of a working group adopted document, and that's why I deliberately did not merge it.
Okay, that makes sense. It was also a bit of a big enough change, but even then, drafts are cheap. We can always roll back. So I do appreciate the care and the content. That is a good sign. All right. With that, that is WIMSE. Thank you guys, everyone. And we will see you hopefully in Bangkok.
Thank you.
Really? I thought that Ori
It's
officially
possible
took
we just
over.
never switched.
Okay.
So I'm going to go find him and ask him about that. Because right now I have 14 and he has 9. So.
Oh,
Yeah,
well,
it was,
that
it was
seems-
supposed to switch after Brisbane. Or, yeah, it was
I mean,
after Brisbane.
that means we probably had 12 and we missed yours. So it doesn't really
Right.
matter who's looking. Doesn't really matter.
Okay.
I just noticed it in the tracker.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I'm happy to.
The way that you guys do the advice through this game.
Right.
I would much rather have documents turning and we have to say, or you have to say, stop it because someone doesn't like it.
Right.